The latest standoff between rural and urban India on the Punjab-Haryana border is yet another confrontation between Bharat's impoverished rural majority and relatively wealthy urban India. Currently, thousands of farmers, mainly from rural Punjab, grouped under the banners of the SKM, non-political, BKU, Dalewal, Kisan Mazdoor Morcha, and 17 other farmers' organizations are on the march to New Delhi to press for legally guaranteed minimum support prices. It's pertinent to note that the movement follows the massive protests staged by farmers 3 years ago in 2020. Essentially, these bills were enacted to apply the logic of the highly successful deregulation and liberalization of Indian industry in 1991 to the farming sector. However, they were fiercely opposed by the farmers' unions, who continued their protest on the Delhi border for over a year during the height of the COVID pandemic crisis. The adamant refusal of the farmers' unions to budge from their demand and continuous camping on highways encircling Delhi forced the union government to repeal the three bills in November 2021. Predominantly an agricultural economy, which was bypassed by the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Indian subcontinent has a long history of peasant revolts in the 20th century, including the Champaran agitation 1917, Kheda Satyagraha 1918, Bardoli Satyagraha 1925, the Tebaka movement 1946. Moreover, there is a mountain of evidence emerging that the worst excesses of the British Raj, heavy coercive taxation by comprador zamindars, uprooting the traditional mixed farming and forced cultivation of monoculture plantation crops, including indigo and opium, were inflicted upon India's peasantry, who constituted 80% of the population until the dawn of independence. Unfortunately, it's insufficiently documented by post-independence historians that it was resolute rural and peasant support astutely mobilized by Mahatma Gandhi in the 20th century that enabled India to free itself from almost 2 centuries of deeply exploitative British rule. Therefore, after the dawn of independence, when free India embarked upon its tryst with destiny, quite rightly, India's rural majority at that time contributed 60% of the GDP, expected rural growth to become the focus of national development. This indeed was the ideal of Mahatma Gandhi, prime architect of India's unique and unprecedented freedom struggle based on satyagraha and ahimsa, which completely flummoxed our erstwhile British masters and prompted their hasty, unlamented departure from Indian shores. Gandhiji advocated rural national development, quote unquote, village republics, stimulating agriculture productivity and generating surpluses to finance employment to create rural MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises. This village led development model was ridiculed by post independence Congress Party leadership and constitutionalists, including Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and Dr. Ambedkar. On the contrary, Jawaharlal Nehru, Free India's first Prime Minister, imposed the Soviet Union style centrally planned heavy industry development model with which he became enamored while a student in London. This economy development model, driven by the Planning Commission and elaborate 5 year plans, necessitated vacuuming meager rural savings for investment into government owned PSEs, that's public sector enterprises, which were forecast to generate vast profits for investment into rural infrastructure development and social welfare, that's public education and health. Unfortunately, the country's 256 central public sector enterprises and an equal number promoted by the state governments, driven by business illiterate bureaucrats and over promoted clerks, proved to be a disaster. They failed to generate the surpluses for investment in rural growth and development. The outcome was disastrous. In the early 1960s, when the monsoons failed, there was a sharp fall in food grain production, and India became heavily dependent upon food imports from the United States, which gave them away at humiliating throwaway prices under its PL 480 program. In popular parlance, newly independent India transformed into a quote, ship to mouth unquote economy. In the early 60s, the three eminent economists, Professor Brahmananda, C.N. Vakil, and B.R. Shenoy, proposed a shift from the heavy industry to a light wage goods production model through the promotion of thousands of labor intensive, light consumer goods and intermediate products enterprises, which would generate mass employment and consumer goods demand required for economic growth. However, this proposal was rejected by Nehru and his daughter Indira Gandhi, who succeeded him as Prime Minister in 65. Mrs. Gandhi nationalized the coal industry, the country's major banks, and for a while the food grains production trade. Luckily, with the introduction of the dwarf variety of Mexican wheat by American scientist Dr. Norman Borlaug and popularized by Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, India's Green Revolution miraculously transformed Indian agriculture. And annual food grains production centered in perennially irrigated Punjab, Haryana, Western Uttar Pradesh, spurted from 79 million tons in the 60s to over 1 million tons in 71. Since then, India's annual food grain production has crossed 300 million tons. Undoubtedly, farmers in these states and regions have prospered, but only modestly because of higher fuel prices after OPEC raised crude oil prices exponentially in 73 and 79, and continuously adverse terms of trade between town and country. Incomes and standards of living in farmers in 26 other states of India compare very poorly with Punjab farmers because the latter have been provided minimum support prices for food grains, wheat and rice, that have made India's ship to mouth economy self sufficient in food production. Somewhat paradoxically, Punjab's relatively wealthy farmers are in the forefront of the agitations which forced the central government to repeal the three farm bills of 2021. Also, in the current agitation for legally guaranteed minimum support prices for 23 crops, plus several other demands mentioned above, which have the potential to wreck the Indian budget. Quote, if they had done their maths, representatives of the 200 farmers unions participating in the latest protests would have realized that Government of India cannot meet their list of demands without risking a severe financial crisis, sabotaging rural banks and disincentivizing and disrupting migration, internal migration, which is the bedrock of farming in the three states. Giving in to farmers' demands would be most irresponsible, says Dr. Neeraj Kaushal, professor of social work at Columbia University, USA, writing in the Economic Times, February 16. Other demands contained in the protesting farmers' charter, such as pensions of rupees 10,000 per month for all farmers and farm labor over 60 years of age, is likely to spiral central and state governments' revenue expenditure, leaving very little capital to spend to build rural infrastructure, which is essential for long-term viability of Indian agriculture. Nevertheless, these extreme demands made by farm union leaders are understandable because the plain truth is that despite suffering the worst excesses of colonial exploitation, there is no denying that rural India has continuously been denied and shortchanged on the issue of reaping the gains of freedom and national development. But this has happened by way of adverse terms of trade between town and country. As a result, the monthly per capita expenditure of rural citizen at rupees 3,700 is half of urban Indians' 6,460. Indeed, a visitor from another planet is likely to identify rural Bharat, whose residents are differentiated by clothes, premature aging, visible malnutrition, as citizens of a totally different country from urban India, with its swish motorcars, glitzy shopping malls, and big weddings. The popular depiction of rural citizens in the media is of wizened turban riots, supplicating urbanized political leaders for handouts. Urban liberals and lefties in particular never tire of highlighting that leaders of current and former agitations are rich, so called rich farmers who get free electricity, water, and fertilizer at subsidized rates. Yet the reality is that rich farmers are wealthy only when compared to other farmers living in substandard housing and struggling to put two square meals on the table. According to Anil Thakur, a graduate of the Royal College of Agriculture, Cirencester, UK, and College of Tropical Agriculture, University of the West Indies, a rural rich farmer, quote, cannot attain the standard of living of a senior government clerk, unquote. Profitable farming is impossible in India without MSP calculated at well above input costs, says Thakur. An economist fluent in three languages who had studied agriculture economics while serving the UN, Sharad Joshi was the first farmers' leader to articulate the India versus Bharat divide and, expose, quote, systematic exploitation of India's rural majority, unquote. According to Joshi, suppressed prices for farm produce are inherent in the centrally planned Soviet inspired heavy industry development model, which necessitates low farm produce prices to provide cheap food for the urban proletariat. Joshi paid a heavy price for moving from the comforts of New York to Chakan village in Maharashtra. His wife died by suicide, and after a decade of struggle for remunerative prices for farm produce, Joshi threw in the towel, was co-opted into the establishment by the Rajiv Gandhi government, and appointed chairman of the toothless Delhi-based Commission for Agriculture Costs and Prices. In December 2015, Joshi, whom your narrator featured in a India versus Bharat cover story in Business World in 1983, passed away in Delhi, his mission unfulfilled. Onions are not included in the 23 crops for which SKM farmers are demanding minimum support price. On the contrary, with onion prices firming up in India last August, a 40% duty was imposed on onion exports, depriving Indian farmers the advantage of high prices abroad. In this connection, it's pertinent to remember that under Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin's compulsory procurement of farm produce at low prices to feed the urban proletariat, over 30 million peasants died of starvation in the Soviet Union of the 1930s. Likewise, an estimated 30 to 45 million Chinese peasants perished during Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward initiative of 58 to 65. In democratic India, farmers don't die of starvation as much as by prolonged malnutrition. That is, millions become dead men walking, even as they pay rock, even as paying rock bottom prices for agricultural produce. India's bourgeoisie has transformed into the world's largest middle class, whose number is estimated at 430 million. Quote, the first and foremost policy action that is needed to remove all bans on agriculture exports, stocking limits on private trade, and stop unloading wheat and rice in the open market below the economic cost of the Food Corporation of India. These are all anti farmer policies designed to favor consumers. The fundamental problem of India's agri food policies is that they are highly tilted towards consumers at the cost of farmers, says Dr. Ashok Gulati, former chairman of the Commission for Agricultural Costs and Prices and currently Infosys chair professor for agriculture at the Indian Council for Research and International Economic Relations, ICRIE, Hyderabad. But the unkindest cut of all inflicted upon the country's rural majority is a conspicuous failure to nurture the development of a vigorous food processing and post harvest industry. Although it's common knowledge that 20% of the country's horticulture produce, valued at over 50,000 crores, and 10% of food grains valued at 10,000 crores, rots because of underdevelopment of downstream food processing industry. Dr. Gulati, who has studied farm economics of over 50 countries, hasn't commented on the huge loss of time, money, and effort suffered by India's farmers because of this policy failure. Surprisingly, India's policy formulators and learned economists are reluctant to draw lessons from the homegrown farm produce success story at the rise of the Amul milk products brand, with visionary farmers champion, the late Dr. Verghese Kurian, who died in 2012, launched in the 1960s. Amul is arguably the country's most famous and loved FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods brand. By carefully calibrating the release of imported, donated milk and dairy products into the Indian market at market prices, Dr. Kurian mobilized capital for investment into milk and dairy processing technology for the Gujarat Cooperative Milk Marketing Federation, that's GCMMF, which promoted the Amul brand. Through this stratagem, GCMMF was able to pay dairy farmers market prices of milk throughout the year. Yet, instead of this dairy farmers champion being hailed as a hero and role model, Kurian was fiercely criticized by communists and leftists in parliament and the media as a quote foreign agent unquote. In 1984, as editor of Business World magazine, your correspondent wrote a detailed cover story titled Operation Flood Case for the Defense, which narrated the facts and circumstances of Korean's heroic conversion of chronically milk deficit India into the world's largest producer of milk and dairy products. However, despite this model, which in effect provides dairy farmers minimum support prices without government intervention, being available for replication for farm produce, especially horticulture produce, for mysterious reasons, it has not been permitted to strike root in Indian soil. Although Kurian himself tried to replicate the successful Amul model for the oilseeds and horticulture sectors, these ventures failed. One explanation of the continuous failure of independent India's rural majority to get remunerative prices for farm produce is that under the constitution, agriculture is essentially a state's list subject, although some sectors are listed in the concurrent list. Some monitors of the paradox of a primarily agriculture economy failing to develop a downstream food processing industry attribute it to the disproportionate influence that agriculture wholesalers and middlemen exercise in the corridors of power of state governments. These middlemen, usually the kith and kin of politicians and bureaucrats, are totally averse to close agriculture industry linkages, which will result in forward markets and contract farming. For decades, they have ensured that only small and micro sector enterprises, rather than organized sector corporates, are licensed to enter the agri produce processing business. Farm leaders, unfortunately, seem unaware that closer linkages between farm and factories is necessary for the growth of a viable agri produce processing industry and cutting out the string of middlemen who multiply farm gate prices 8 to 10 fold before farm produce, especially perishable fruits and vegetables, reaches the consumer. Closer farm factory linkage is also necessary to stimulate crop diversification and break the status quo, which is heavily despoiling land quality in the food grain growing states of Punjab, Haryana, and western Uttar Pradesh. Moreover, perhaps even greater injustice visited upon the country's majority in the rural Bharat by India's central planners, policy formulators, and ruling establishment is open, continuous, and uninterrupted neglect of education. For over 3 decades, the annual status of education report, published that's ASER, published by the highly reputed Pratham Education Foundation, has been reporting that over 50% of class 8, 7 to 8 children in rural India can't read class 2 textbooks with sufficient fluency and comprehension in their own vernacular mother tongues, let alone English, the national link language and language of business and commerce and law. Simultaneously, Education World, established 1999, has been persistently pressing for the annual budgetary expenditure Center Plus states for public education to be raised to 6% of GDP. This recommendation was made by the high powered Kothari Commission in 1967. Despite your editors annually presenting a schema coinciding with the presentation of the union budget for the center alone to raise an additional rupees 7 lakh crore per year, national education expenditure has remained mired in the 3 to 3.5% GDP rut for 75 years. Moreover, pathetic meager outlays for rural government schools are recklessly misspent. Over 85% goes towards the high remuneration of ill qualified and indifferent teachers. 25% of government school teachers countrywide, that is 1.25 million teachers, largely drawn from the kith and kin of politicians and bureaucrats, are absent every single day. The country's 1.10 million government, especially rural schools, are notorious for dilapidated buildings, lack of furniture, multi-grade teaching, inadequate toilets, drinking water, and often electricity. Likewise, India's few and far between higher education institutions are in very poor condition. And despite reckless government establishment and academia negligence to develop India's abundant and high potential human resource, there is no shortage of economists on television and television news channels and in the print media who opine that the national development effort necessitates massive migration of rural youth to urban industry. The uncomfortable question about the employability of millions of illiterate, quasi-literate, and unskilled. India hosts only 5,000 vocational training institutes against China's 500,000. This is routinely fudged. In the circumstances, it's high time to frankly admit that India's rural citizens have been substantially sidelined in the national development effort and to make amends to right this imbalance. First, it's time to cut through the nitpicking clutter of legally protected MSPs by establishing an agricultural produce stabilization fund suggested by Professor A.S. Gulati of ICRIE, quoted earlier, from which central and state governments could draw to purchase crops whose prices fall below mutually agreed floor prices. Subsequently, all hurdles to establishing food processing enterprises should be immediately removed to reduce distress selling and colossal waste of farm, especially horticulture produce. Simultaneously, government needs to agree not to interfere by way of import and export curbs when farm commodity prices rise. Like coffee and tea growers, all farmers should be entitled to make windfall gains when global prices rise. Lessons need to be drawn from neighboring China's example of facilitating the establishment of millions of TVEs, that is, town and village enterprises, which have transformed agriculture dependent China into a manufacturing hub of the world. In short, the logic of the 1991 liberalization deregulation, which removed moribund Indian industry, which revived Indian industry, needs to be applied to rural India. Yet at bottom, delivering high quality education in rural India, especially in government schools and colleges, is the essential precondition of bridging the India Bharat divide. Population growth is accelerating fragmentation of already small rural farms, whose average size is only 2.67 acres. This necessitates higher per acre food grain yields, which are currently one-tenth of US and European farms and one-fifth of China. In turn, this requires adequately schooled farmers rather than adults who can't read a fertilizer or pesticide usage leaflet. It's also time to accept that rural school leavers, exhorted by smug economists and media pundits to migrate to the factories and workplaces of urban India, need to be sufficiently qualified and skilled to become employable. Concurrently, rising tide of ill-educated, unemployable rural youth is spreading across the country in the form of quote migrant workers unquote forced to work in low-paid jobs in the construction and services sector and increasingly taking to crime and violence. These phenomena are a warning to the central and state governments, the establishment, and academia to pay greater attention to public, including skills education in agrarian India. This is necessary to ensure that the widening India Bharat fissure doesn't become an unbridgeable divide.